Well, hello and welcome to Sunday Morning Coffee with Dr. Childress here. Today I'm going to be reviewing a research article by Nedeljkovic, Dinic, and Tucakovic uh, related to the Dark Triad: personality, forgiveness, and anger rumination. And this is from the journal. Their article was published in the journal Personality and Individual Differences. And so this is coming from actual real knowledge that's not in the family courts. This isn't about necessarily directly on what's happening in the family courts. However, the pathology in the family courts is narcissistic borderline and dark personality pathology, and particularly the dark triads and dark tetrads, vulnerable dark triad. So that pathology is in the family courts and it's not being diagnosed, it's not being treated, it's not being addressed in any way. And that's a significant problem. Once we start to apply actual real knowledge to the problem in the family courts, a wealth of knowledge opens up to us. All these interconnections. So all the research on the attachment system is relevant. All the research on family systems is relevant, and the research on personality pathology is relevant. And particularly of concern are the dark personalities. So Nedeljkovic, Dinic, and Tucakovic have done an excellent article in this. This is really a spot-on good article, both within the dark personality domain, but also to its relevance within the family courts. So I wanted to discuss this article and highlight both its findings and its relevance. So their article here is the Dark Triad and Forgiveness, the mediating role of anger rumination. And the relevance to the family courts is that the Dark Triad is present in the family courts. And so we need to address this type of personality pathology that's manipulating the court system to the destruction of the child's life and the targeted parent's life. The dark triad is highly vengeful, and here we have a ending of a romantic relationship and a divorce, and the dark triad is vengeful. That's a dangerous person. And the risks for spousal abuse, using the child as a weapon surrounding a dark triad personality, are substantial. So that's where we need to really be focused in the family courts, is understanding what the pathology is here, so that we can take proper protective responses. Anger rumination is the key to understanding the vengeance motivation of the dark triad personality. And so when I saw Nedeljkovic and the colleagues address the anger rumination part of the dark triad and the absence of forgiveness, which is another central feature that's locking up the child in the family courts, I was happy. That's spot on to the clinical issues relative to the dark personality. The clinical implication then, based on that, is to interrupt the anger rumination. And so that going forward, that's going to be key to an element of the treatment plan for the family, is to interrupt that anger rumination. And mostly it's about grief rumination. It's the grief that's driving the issue. So this is from Nedeljkovic, Dinic, and Tucakovic. Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy are three interrelated malevolent traits known as the dark triad. While these traits share central characteristics of callousness and interpersonal manipulation, they are also distinct from each other. And so that's interesting. We're not looking at narcissistic or borderline, but we're looking at a blend of personality types that is particularly malevolent. But each blend is distinct into itself as to what it contributes to the pathology. So Machiavellianism refers to manipulative tendencies, goal orientation behavior, and moral relativism Narcissistic trait represents a subclinical manifestation of narcissistic personality disorder and frames the features of grandiosity, superiority, domination, and need for admiration. Psychopathy encompasses callousness, lack of empathy and remorse, and disinhibited behavior. So the Dark Triad is a particularly malevolent human when you get this combination of personality traits. All of these traits are known for their relations with socially undesirable and maladaptive outcomes, such as reactive and proactive aggression. Individuals high in Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and to a lesser extent narcissism also tend to be vengeful and less forgiving. And that's critical, or a central piece of the pathology in the family courts, is that idea of vengefulness and absence of forgiveness with the child. The child's going through a grief response relative to the divorce, and they are ruminating. That's what's causing the rumination, is the unresolved sadness of the grief response. But then under the influence of the narcissistic borderline dark personality, the child is misattributing the sadness over to anger. So it becomes the anger rumination and the desire for revenge. And you can see that in the child's behavior, but it's coming from the parent, the allied parent, the narcissistic borderline dark personality parent. And so the grief response of the child that happens surrounding the divorce is getting twisted into anger and resentment loaded with revengeful wishes. That's the Kernberg quote. That it has to do with pathological mourning, the pathological processing of sadness. And the absence of empathy is the capacity for cruelty that we see in this type of pathology. The child's emotional rumination is created by the pain of their grief and loss, but is being translated as anger rumination about a supposed grievance. So the child has this sadness, this grief response, it hurts. The pathological dark personality parent twists that pain into a belief that it's being caused by the targeted parent because of something bad they're doing. They generate this grievance, this grudge, that then the child occupies themselves around rumination about their supposed victimization and the unjustness of the situation. But actually for the child, it's being driven by a grief response underneath everything. And so in treatment, when we have this child locked up in this emotional dysregulation, the high anxiety or the high anger, we need to relax the child's locked up emotional structures. And the way to that is through forgiveness and compassion. Those are the domains that are going to relax the child's interpersonal networks to allow for a reparation of a relationship. And so we're going to need to intervene on the anger rumination to stop that process, and the grief process underneath that. We have to resolve that grief process and then help the child move into more forgiveness and compassion place to allow for resolution of the family conflict. The anger rumination, as defined by Sukodolsky et al., can be seen as thinking about the feeling of anger. While anger is frequently linked to aggression, those who hold feelings of anger do not necessarily display aggression. Instead, anger rumination influences the intensity and duration of the anger experience. So that's where we see this really high anger from the child over a long period of time, years even. That's the anger rumination that's causing that, influencing the intensity and duration of the anger experience, while the display of aggression is likely to be influenced by the other factors, such as executive control. And executive control is, they're talking about the frontal lobe executive function systems. That's not developed in childhood. So we won't have executive control in children. So that's where we get to see the anger and the high anxiety displays and all the dysregulated behavior, because they don't have the regulatory executive control system to be able to handle the emotions that are being triggered. And consequently, anger ruminations are likely to lead to the intention to revenge and impede forgiveness. These findings align with the integrative cognitive model of trait anger and reactive aggression, which we regard as one of the frameworks for understanding how anger ruminations relate to personality traits and forgiveness. Now, I would modify this just a little bit, just from my background, to say that a trait anger model, I'm kind of familiar with what those approaches are. The anger is actually linked to the sadness, so it's going to be linked to the grief response. The child is misattributing a grief response to being injury by the other parent, and is being generated into this grievance of victimization, the persecutory delusion, and that the parent deserves to be punished for being a bad parent, which is the spousal theme, that they deserve to be punished for being a bad spouse, but is being translated and expressed by the child. So the child's being used as a weapon of spousal abuse. The child's authentic experience, though, is not one of anger. It's one of sadness and grief and loss. And that creates an authentic pain that then the pathological dark parent is able to manipulate the interpretation of why that pain is there. Oh, it's because they're a bad parent. No, it's not. It's because you miss them. It's a grief response. It's totally normal. The pain is. And the way to fix the pain is you restore the relationship. But as long as the relationship remains breached, there's going to be that pain of grief and loss that then is fueled into the grievance. And so to help the child move into a more receptive place, we have to move away from the narcissistic value that it's okay to be cruel to people if they deserve it. And that's not true. No, we're not nice to other people because of who they are. We're nice because of who we are. That belief that it's okay to be cruel to people if they deserve it is the spousal abuse theme. Yeah, of course I hit her. She deserved it. My dinner was cold. So that's the narcissistic value system of abuse. And we need to help re-anchor the child in healthy value systems having to do with compassion and forgiveness and empathy and just being nice. And help the child. That will allow us, from a solution-focused approach, to just move into the solution of repaired relationship. The moment we get a repaired relationship, the grief response drops and the situation resolves itself. But right now, we got the child all locked up as being used as an instrument of revenge in the spousal conflict or in the spousal abuse. So, according to this model, individuals with certain characteristics, such as low agreeableness, are more prone to interpreting situations in a hostile manner, which triggers anger. I would add a persecutory delusion up there. And so it's a misinterpretation of situations. So Nedeljkovic, Dinic, and Tucakovic talk about the misattribution or the characteristic of low agreeableness, creating the misinterpretation of events to see things as being dangerous when they're not. I would add the persecutory thought disorder from unresolved trauma that sees the world as a malevolent place. And as a result of both of those belief systems, that they've been unjustly treated by the world and that the world is a malevolent place, so either the anger or the fear-based components of that, both of those are getting translated into the angry response, the defensive response of attack the world to protect yourself. And then ruminating about the hostile thoughts prolongs and intensifies the experience of anger, while effortful control plays a counteractive role of promoting reappraisal. So if the person is able to contain their anger. The anger is going to get up and motivate them for revenge, and they kind of nurse that anger through the ruminations. But if they can maintain that executive control of the situation, of their emotions, then that allows them to reappraise the situation and say, you know what, this isn't a dangerous situation. This isn't, my past childhood situation. This isn't an actual hostile threat that's posed to me by the people out there. But if they're not allowed to, if they don't have that capacity, frontal lobe executive function capacity, then they're overcome by their emotions and the desire for revenge. And that's what we're worried about in the court system, is then they use the child as an instrument of revenge. However, in individuals weak with effortful control, which may be observed in those high in the dark triad, the ruminative process is likely to contribute to anger expression, reactive aggression, and harboring of grudges. And that harboring of grudges is exactly what we see with the child. That's the associated clinical sign, the unforgivable event. They will hold on to this supposedly unforgivable event, as justification for all current and future rejection. And that's where we need to move into kind of forgiveness and compassion, and just relax that emotional rigidity that the child has. But that's going to be interrupting their anger rumination, the ruminative process with this. So the present study of Nedeljkovic, Dinic, and Tucakovic is previous findings pointed to the relationship between dark traits, anger rumination, and forgiveness. As discussed previously, the dark triad traits, particularly Machiavellianism and psychopathy, have been found to relate positively to anger rumination and negatively to forgiveness. So we're going to see exactly the pathology that we're seeing from the dark triad. And so based on the dark triad, we could predict what we're going to see in the family courts. We're seeing the anger rumination and the anger and the grudge, the grievance, the unforgivable event. Additionally, anger rumination has been linked to lower levels of forgiveness, and it has been suggested to impede the forgiveness process. Therefore, we assume that anger ruminations will mediate the dark triad and forgiveness relations. In other words, we expect that anger rumination will likely foster revenge motivation in the dark triad and thus hinder forgiveness. So they pretty much describe the emotional process going on in the family courts. So what they did, they looked at 692 participants. They used three measures: a short dark triad, the anger rumination scale, and a forgiveness scale, and then did correlations among all of those to work out a path analysis. And one of the things I want to point out to everybody in the family courts is, like, research actually has data associated with it. It's not opinion pieces. So when I read opinion pieces in the family court literature, that's pretty worthless. Okay, so people have opinions. Great, you have an opinion. Where's the data? And so that's where we need to start getting data in the family courts, because it's just the fact that we don't have research on the families in the family courts is a professional abomination. In 40 years, we need to get actual data on what's happening over here. And look, we should be looking at the dark triad personality. We should be looking at a lot of stuff. So what they did what's called a path analysis. So we conducted a path analysis to explore the mediating role of anger rumination in the relationship between dark triad traits and forgiveness. A path analysis is pre-identifying a particular path of relationships and correlations that you're predicting between a set of variables, and then you go and collect all of the various data and see if the correlations match up to their predicted paths and associations. So basically what they're predicting is the dark triad personality will lead to revenge motivations and the absence of forgiveness, and the mediating factor in that connection is going to be the anger rumination. And so it's the anger rumination that connects the dark triad personality structures to the motivation for revenge and the absence of forgiveness. So the findings: Machiavellian and psychopathy were positive related to anger ruminations and negatively to forgiveness. In contrast, narcissism showed weak associations only with thoughts of revenge and had no significant relationships with other dimensions of rumination or forgiveness scales. These results are aligned with earlier studies that showed Machiavellianism and psychopathy, but not narcissism, are associated with higher vengefulness and lower forgiveness, and with higher anger rumination. They discuss this discrepancy between the narcissism and from the Machiavellianism and the psychopathy, that the inconsistency in findings could be attributed to different aspects of narcissism captured by the measurement instruments used. Studies directly comparing grandiose and vulnerable narcissism have indicated that only the vulnerable aspects of the trait is linked to anger rumination. We could therefore attribute the absence of relationships with narcissism due to the SD3, the Dark Triad measure, which captures mostly grandiose features of narcissism. So there's your next research study. If you want access to a lot of Dark Triad personalities, start doing research on the family courts because you'll find them in abundance over here. So although Machiavellianism and psychopathy showed positive associations with all dimensions of rumination, it is important to highlight that these traits exhibited the strongest association with thoughts of revenge. One could assume that individuals high in Machiavellianism and psychopathy, in addition to ruminating about their angry feelings and memories, tend to ruminate the most about revenge due to the anticipation of experiencing positive emotions following vengeance. And that is a key piece to understand, that final point, that they nurse these feelings of and they ruminate about their grievances and their sense of injury because it gratifies this experience, the positive emotions of the revenge that will be coming. And so they generate these feelings. And this is a key feature of the terrorist mind that triggers the terrorist mind. A lot of us have within us the trauma pathology, but we don't trigger into the pathological anger and pathological violence. The minds that trigger start with the rumination. And so they begin to ruminate, and that inflames the injury, inflames the damage to the point that eventually they seek that positive release. And that's in the violent act, the school shooting or the terrorist act, is that final culmination of that release and gratification. And this is all on the sadistic line. So I would offer that with the dark personalities, I would offer we always have the sadistic line involved. And so we're always kind of looking at the dark tetrad with this personality. There's a gratification of that revenge motivation that's prominent with the darks. So let's see. So one could just, yeah, so they experience the positive motivations of the. Lastly, our findings go beyond filling the knowledge gap in this area and have implications for practitioners. Psychologists could employ mindfulness and cognitive behavior training to assist individuals with high dark traits in managing their tendencies for anger rumination and promoting forgiveness. Now, cognitive behavior therapy and mindfulness training is dialectic behavior therapy. So essentially, they're recommending dialectic behavior therapy for the dark personality pathology in the family courts, and I agree with that. Unfortunately, DBT is not yet adapted to the family courts, so that's going to have to need to occur. We're going to have to adapt DBT to a family therapy type administration and bring in others like emotionally focused therapy, attachment related information. So the revenge motivation surrounding divorce in the family courts, the clinical concern is for a DSM-5 diagnosis of spouse or partner abuse psychological of the targeted parent by the allied parent using the child as a weapon. So that's my clinical diagnostic concern related to the dark personalities and the revenge motivation. We need to be getting a proper assessment to see if that's happening, to see if we have a dark dark triad personality who's creating pathology in the child as a weapon of spousal abuse against the targeted parent in revenge for the failed marriage and divorce. And we have duty to protect obligations. And the dark personalities are the core of evil. That's what people in the personality research domain are calling them, is evil. And I agree with it. When you have narcissistic, psychopathic, extremely manipulative, and sadistic, yeah, that's the most malevolent human on the planet. And they're in the family courts. They're not being addressed. They're not being diagnosed or treated. And they're being allowed to manipulate the courts to their own desires, which is destroying the lives of children and the targeted parent. So, the pathology of concern in the family courts is a shared persecutory delusion and false factitious attachment pathology imposed on the child by the pathogenic parenting of a narcissistic borderline dark personality parent for secondary gain to the pathological parent of manipulating the court's decisions regarding child custody. There's your Machiavellian manipulation, and to meet the parent's own emotional and psychological needs, including the desire for spousal revenge and spousal abuse. So that's the 2023 article. Nedeljkovic and Tucakovic also have a 2022 article called Understanding Evil, a closer look at the dark tetrad's relations with Hexaco and Big Five. The Hexaco and Big Five are personality assessments, and the Hexaco has been shown to identify dark traits, and they were looking at whether the Hexaco or the Big Five personality measure did a better job of identifying dark personalities, and they concluded that the Hexaco was better. And the reason for the name, honesty is the H, emotionality is the E, X, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and open to experience, Hexaco. And it's a personality measure. You can get it, researchers can get it. And a low H, a low honesty, humility is the score associated with the dark personality traits. So if you want to be assessing for the personality, the forensic psychologists, I don't know what they're doing using they use like all these different personality. No, use the Hexaco. If you know what you're doing in the family courts and you're assessing and you want to do a test, use the Hexaco. But you don't make a diagnosis based on testing. It's a mental status exam with thought and perception. But again, I'm just going to put in my plug. If you're going to be doing testing, Robert's apperception test for children. Let's get a window into the child. Holy cow. The fact that the forensic custody evaluators are not administering the Hexaco or not administering the Roberts is professional negligence if they're administering testing. But the issue is, for me, you don't need the testing to make the diagnosis. So from a clinical aspect, there's no reason to do a Hexaco or do a Roberts. Making the diagnosis based on the persecutory delusion, that's a mental status exam with thought and perception. We pop it out in the session, take a look at it. But if people are going to do assessments, these are the assessments you would want to do. Now, in clinical practice, we're not allowed to do assessments unless we have a reason to do them. Unless there's a clinical reason, we don't do assessments because it's intrusion and privacy issues and all sorts of things. And so from a clinical perspective, I have no need to administer the Hexaco or the Roberts to make the diagnosis. So it's not part of my treatment protocol that you see. A diagnostic checklist for pathogenic parenting will diagnose the pathology. However, if anybody's ever doing research on the family court pathology, such as a pilot program for the family courts, include the Hexaco and include the Roberts apperception test for research purposes, because we can't do it for clinical purposes. Um, yeah, so those are the studies by Nedeljkovic and his colleagues, Dinic and Tucakovic, regarding the dark personalities, the mediating role of anger rumination, which I think they are spot on the core of the issues for the dark personalities. And I think it expands out into um, the terrorist mind. And so the terrorist, what's the trigger for the terrorist is the anger rumination. You won't find the trigger if you just do a broad screening. It's once the person starts to activate into the anger rumination, they then construct the the trigger that's going to trigger the violence later on. And that trigger construction process is the anger rumination. So get a handle on that, jump on that. That's the intervention point to stop the escalation and to treat the children in the family courts. Now, in treating the children in the family courts, understand that the anger rumination is actually a grief rumination. It's the grief and the pain of the grief that's driving the ruminative process. It's just the grief is being misinterpreted as a grievance, and then that's being used to generate the anger rumination. But it's targeting that and understanding that and moving towards a healthy value system, away from the narcissistic value systems of cruelty over to the healthy value systems of compassion and forgiveness and empathy and relationship and bonding and love. And to relax the child out of that locked in emotional place that they're in right now. Relax it out. And so this study is valuable in understanding the processes within the family courts and future studies related to the Dark Triad. And again, let me close by emphasizing the moment we start to apply actual knowledge, a wealth of knowledge becomes available that we can apply. And then the knowledge begins to interconnect. So the personality pathology is going to interconnect with attachment trauma. And then both of those are going to lead to the family systems pathology. And so everything interconnects once we apply knowledge. So no matter how we look at the pathology, we're seeing the same thing. And that's how we have confidence in our diagnosis, because every way we look at it, it's still the same thing that we're looking at. So with that, I'm going to head off to my Sunday here, and take care, everybody, and good luck to you and getting your family all fixed up.